Hi, everyone. Welcome to Happy to See Me, the podcast that puts the spotlight on the overlooked and underestimated. I'm Erika Casupanan, and this week I am speaking with therapist Simone Saunders. But first, I love to start each episode talking about something I was happy to see this week. And this might seem simple, but truly what I was happy to see this week is I got my balcony set up for the year. If you live in a warm place, this probably doesn't feel like a big deal for you. But here in Canada and in Toronto, it is cold a lot of the year. It was really gray this year. So being able to have an outdoor space is such a game changer. This week, I've been able to work out there. I've been able to host friends out there. And I know that June can be a really busy month with it being warm and with Pride and so many things going on. And I want to make sure I don't lose sight of how I am grateful for the little things, like being able to sit outside with my laptop and do some work in the sun, or having a place where I can have a drink with a friend and a long conversation and catch up. I know that there are always exciting things going on, and I want to make sure I never lose sight of how amazing it is to have a home that is colorful, that I can host people at. And that is really for me, because being at home rules, okay? I love being at home. And my balcony is colorful. It is fruit themed, so I have different fruity things out there. I'm trying to get a few more fruity things for the balcony. Once I do, I'll make sure that I post videos or photos on social media so you can see my little happy place. But what I was happy to see this week is finally being able to spend time on the balcony. And it feels good, okay? Let me just feel good. And speaking of feelings, this week I am speaking with Simone Saunders. Simone is a psychotherapist and the founder of the Cognitive Corner, which was created to amplify and celebrate the diversity of our experiences. Simone is also a content creator with more than 500,000 followers on TikTok. She makes content about nervous system dysregulation, body disconnection, and she gives us a glimpse into her life as a therapist. In this episode, we are talking about feelings, and in particular, feeling your feelings. So we talk about what happens when you are disconnected from your body and when you over-intellectualize your emotions. So if you know someone who is working on feeling their feelings, make sure you share this episode with them. So let's just get into it. Here is my interview with Simone Saunders. I hope you enjoy it. Simone Saunders, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to see you today.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm so excited.
Now, I want to set up some context in case there are people who are only listening to the audio version of this podcast. I know that a lot of people only listen to the audio. If you have not seen Simone on TikTok before, TikTok describes her as Kelly Rowland's doppelganger. So keep that in mind during this interview. Is that something you get a lot in real life and online?
Yeah. 100%.
Does it get old?
Yeah, after 3 years on TikTok, I'm like, okay.
You are such a good sport about it, though, truly.
Thank you. Thank you. She's gorgeous, so it's definitely a compliment.
Oh, yeah. I was a big Destiny's Child person growing up. When I saw you, I was like, she kind of looks like Kelly Rowland. And then when I've seen the way that you've been able to poke fun at it, I'm like, she's awesome. So congrats on that.
Thank you.
So in addition to doing so well on TikTok, and congratulations for being a Canadian to build up this big following on TikTok, I know that you are a psychotherapist, and you've talked about how it's been challenging for you to find a therapist who looked like you a few years ago. So what made it so challenging, and why was it so important for you to find someone who looked like you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to answer that question, I'll sort of go back to the beginning when I was initially just trying to find a therapist. And initially, I wasn't really trying to find someone who looked like me. And I went through therapist after therapist, and there was parts of my identity that I noticed weren't really acknowledged. And I felt a little bit weird bringing it up, like myself as a Black woman, my experiences, especially in young adulthood. And so then at some point, I decided, okay, I think I need someone who looks a little bit more like me. And it was really difficult to find. And so the first time that I started therapy, I think I was probably 21 or 22. And so around that time, it was difficult because there just weren't that many people in the field, or advertised, I should say. And I believe the stat in the States, I don't know if they have these stats in Canada, but the stat in the States is, I think it's between like 2 and 4% of therapists are Black in the States. Wow. And so the field, it's very limited as far as the actual practitioners that are there. So a lot of times it's not necessarily even just about, okay, how do I find them because they're out there? It's about the fact that there's just not very many in the field.
Wow. So then, were you able to find a therapist that you think suited you, or did this kick off your journey to become a therapist yourself?
Yeah, so I did find someone who suited me, and then she closed her practice, which was so devastating. And then I went through a couple therapists, and now I have one that I've been with for quite some time, and she is a Black woman as well. And so that has been super helpful for me. But I would definitely say that that also sort of gave me the inkling, okay, if I want representation in this space, I can also provide that as well.
You started the Cognitive Corner. So can you explain a little bit about what that is and how this relates to this journey you had to find a Black therapist?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Cognitive Corner is a group psychological practice. Initially, it just started out as just me, but we are a team of 7 now. And so the idea behind it, I mean, initially it was just a psychoeducational social media page. But if we fast forward to 2021, the initial part of it was that I wanted to create a space where, regardless of whatever identity that you hold, the different parts of your identity, the therapist that you see at the Cognitive Corner is going to be someone who is able to acknowledge and celebrate and integrate those parts of your identity into your session. So that could look like race, that could look like sexuality, gender, all of the different things that sort of contribute to who you are.
Nice. Do you think that if somebody has a therapist and they don't share the same identity as you in terms of race or gender or sexual orientation, that you can still benefit from them?
Absolutely. I think that the therapist also has to do the appropriate work, though. So I think that there's definitely experiences that you might find that, you really resonate with someone if they're the same culture, if they're the same sexuality or whatever it might be. However, I do think that it's our job as therapists to be able to do the work to actually be able to acknowledge those things in the room. So for me, as a Black woman, I can't say that just because I'm a Black woman, all the Black clients I see, I understand their experience just because I'm Black. I still have to do the work because I have a different experience, they have a different experience. And while there might be some, commonalities, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm an expert.
Yeah, 100%. That's the thing. It's not like you can paint it all with the same brush. It's kind of case by case per patient and per therapist. How do you assess if a therapist is a good fit for you?
I mean, I think part of it is sort of like a felt sense, and part of it is some of like the, I guess, logistical pieces. So fit as far as, number one, do you like them? Do you like their personality? Do you feel comfortable with them? And I always preface saying, are you comfortable with them, with knowing that therapy is uncomfortable at first. So if you're uncomfortable at first, I think that's just natural because this is a stranger to you right now. Mm-hmm. But as you go through the sessions, are they someone that makes you feel comfortable? Are they someone that is validating, empathetic? Do you feel judged by them? Are there little red flags? Like, are they late all the time? Do they communicate with you well? And then I think on sort of the cultural scale, do they bring up those things? Do they have the hard conversations with you? Because I think that's also really important to acknowledge.
That's true. You're meant to be challenged when you're in there. I mean, I've been in therapy for a long time. Whenever I tell my friends to get started in therapy, they're always like, oh, I did the first session, but I didn't really get anything out of it. I'm like, well, they can't really give you anything because you really have to give parts of yourself. And I'm always like, wait, at least 3. Get to 3, because I think that at 3 is where it happens. Do you find that people have a similar journey when they're in therapy?
Yeah, I think that generally people, when they come to therapy, the first session, they're like, okay, this is all the stuff that I want to do. These are all the things I want to fix. These are all the issues I want to tackle. And then a lot of the times the expectation is, okay, we're going to get through at least some of these things in today's session. And the way that I like to frame it is that a lot of the things that people are struggling with, you have developed these coping tools, these behaviors over however many years. And so to have the expectation that in one hour session, a lot of these things are going to just be gone or just going to be solved isn't necessarily realistic.
Part of the reason why your content really resonated with me is because of your approach to therapy. And I've seen you talk a lot on TikTok about feeling your feelings. I think that that's an idea that gets kind of thrown around a lot. What does it mean to you to feel your feelings?
I think it's about that felt sense. So I think it's in part like witnessing and acknowledging. So often when we have different feelings, like let's say I'm sad, my initial sort of reaction might be, how can I fix this? And so to feel those feelings would mean acknowledging the fact that I'm sad. What does it feel like to be sad? What does it feel like in my body? How do I know that I'm sad? And sitting with that before I even get to the point of fixing. because I think that there's a gap there that a lot of us often miss of, okay, I feel this. What do I do about it? And that sitting with allows you to be comfortable with a lot of your different emotions.
Yeah, it's honestly such a game changer. I had been seeing a therapist for years, and then recently I switched therapists, just someone who better suited where I was at this point in my life. And they primarily do somatic therapy, which I had never done before. And I know that that's a type of therapy that you practice. So can you explain how somatic therapy is a bit different from other common forms of therapy?
Yeah, so somatic therapy essentially really deals with the body and the different sensations that happen in the body. So a lot of time when I talk about sensations, people are like, what are you talking about? So for example, the feeling that you get when you're hungry, when your stomach growls, that's an internal sensation that your body sends you to tell you like, hey, we got to eat something. The sensation of being thirsty. So those are sort of examples of things that motivate you to just meet your needs. But there's a lot of sensations that happen in order to tell you more about your experience, whether you like or you dislike something, whether you're comfortable or uncomfortable. And so it's tapping into a lot of those sensations and really understanding from a body perspective, what is happening for you.
I remember I was so skeptical at first when I was doing somatic therapy. My therapist would stop me and say, okay, let's stop and figure out how that feels in your body. And I'm like, what? And I can think about a lot of things. I can articulate a lot of things. So my therapist had to give me a list of verbs, and then I'd have to pick the verb and the part of my body where I was feeling something. So I was like, okay, let me just try this. But I think for me, where it clicked is I was doing this exercise, and then my therapist pointed out, did you notice that your body reacted the same way in this situation as it did in this other situation? And I was like, oh, okay, I understand why this is important. How does having that connection to your body help you as you're trying to work through different issues?
Yeah, so there's a concept called procedural learning. And so the best way that I like to describe it is when you learn how to tie your shoe. The first few times that you learn, you really have to focus on, okay, how do I get the bunny ears and wrap them together? Slowly over time, you tie your shoe and you don't even really think about what your fingers are doing. It just happens. And so that happens in the body with a lot of different processes. So the way that you might show up if you're intimidated by someone, maybe your sort of reaction to that is just to make yourself smaller. And that's something that happens because of that procedural learning. So it's important to take a look at sort of how these sensations come up, because it allows us to then take a pause when those things are happening. And so when we're able to consistently recognize like, oh, this is what it feels like when X, Y, and Z is happening, then once that comes up, you can say like, okay, maybe this is time for a pause now that I recognize that this is even happening internally. And I can either choose to make a different decision or just allow that space to be there, even if you do make the same decision.
Do you feel like a lot of people are connected to what they're feeling in their bodies right now?
No. I think a combination of societal stuff and our own personal histories kind of make it so that a lot of us are disconnected. And this is something I talk a lot about, especially like in workshops, because, for example, as women, right, where a lot of us have the sort of automatic behavior of like, oh, I'm going to suck in my stomach so that my stomach looks a little bit flatter, right? And so a lot of us will walk around all day long with our stomach sucked in just a little bit. And over time, it's not something that you really, really notice, but that's not really what our body is wanting or meant to be doing. And so even that's just a small micro example of how different societal influences can impact how connected to our body we are. And I think things like work, right? We as a culture are so busy and we sort of celebrate like, oh, you only got 6 hours of sleep. Great job. You're working so hard. Or, I didn't have time for a lunch break, all of those different things. So I think a lot of us probably could be more connected.
I feel like there's probably so many expectations on people on what it means to be successful and to be productive and to be busy, and stopping to think about the way we feel usually is not in anyone's top 10 list on what they should be doing. How can people get more connected to their bodies?
I think it's a lot of intentional work. So where I personally like to start off with is, are you meeting your basic needs? So sleeping, eating, going to the bathroom, drinking water. Are you noticing when you're hungry, or is it that you only notice when you're at the point where you have a headache and you feel like you're dizzy? Do you notice when you're getting thirsty, or is it at the point where you're like, oh my gosh, I'm parched? So when we're able to at least start to connect to those pieces, then it can allow more space for us to understand, what does it feel like when I'm sad or when I'm scared when I'm angry.
I find that sometimes those things come up when you don't even realize. So I had the experience at the end of last year, I came out publicly. So I came out in my 30s. And before that, whenever I would go to my RMT every couple months, I'd always have so much tension between my shoulders. And I thought it was because for 10 years, I worked at a desk job. So it was just from me sitting at the computer. But then after I quit my job, and then I would sit at the computer, but not for as long as I normally would, I still had this tension in my shoulders. And it wasn't until I came out, I went to the RMT and they were like, oh, you don't have that same tension anymore. And I'm like, oh my gosh, was I carrying this in my body for years and I had no idea? Can people carry these habits with them for that long and truly have no idea what was going on?
Absolutely. Because your body just gets used to it, right? We develop these sort of micro coping skills over such a long period of time that eventually our body it feels natural. And so when it releases, then like you said, you go and you see your RMT and then they're like, whoa, something's different here.
Yes, it was very eye-opening to me. And I'm like, okay, maybe I can move through the world physically in a different way too. I've also seen you on TikTok talking a lot about nervous system dysregulation. So what is that?
So when we think of our nervous system, the way that I like to describe it is the sort of emotion center of the brain. It's called the amygdala. And so I like to compare that to a smoke detector. So similar to a smoke detector in your home, if you're making grilled cheese and you burn your grilled cheese, smoke comes up, your smoke detector goes off. But your smoke detector also goes off if your house is in flames. So that's similar to the amygdala, where the amygdala and the smoke detector can't necessarily tell the difference between real and perceived danger. And so when our amygdala feels like, okay, something dangerous is happening, something really activating is happening, then that amygdala turns on, and then we go into fight, flight, freeze, fawn, one of those options. And so the fight response, that's the fight and the flight are sort of more emotionally activated response. We might run away from a situation. We might be physically fighting, or it might be sort of like a verbal or just an intensity in our bodies. And then that freeze and fawn, sometimes more of that low activation. So the freeze, you might notice a little bit of emotional numbness, dissociation. The fawn, you might notice a lot of just people pleasing or just acquiescing to situations that you might not necessarily agree with.
How does someone end up with a dysregulated nervous system?
Well, I mean, I think that everybody has a dysregulated nervous system at some point because the mechanism is there to keep us safe. So ideally, if a bear were to run through this room right now, I would need that dysregulation in order for my brain to say, like, we need to survive. We need to get out of here. And so chronic dysregulation happens when either the concept of like death by 1,000 cuts of there's micro traumas happening all of the time, or it can be something, a couple of large or one large big one. And then that's how we learn to cope is, okay, I don't feel like I'm safe. And so I always have to be in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode.
Got it. So yes, we should be scared if the bear enters the room. But then the challenge is if your nervous system is dysregulated all of the time or in situations when you're not necessarily unsafe.
So ideally, it's a situation where your nervous system gets activated and it comes back down because you're able to just sort of cope through it, or it's just sort of a micro stress. But if it's something where your nervous system goes up and then it stays up for a long time, that's when we notice a lot of these things like chronic tension, pain, a lot of different health issues, digestive issues, because cortisol isn't supposed to be released at that rate for such a prolonged period.
I feel so sad when I think about people being in situations like that when they're always stressed out. So if people can identify that their nervous system is dysregulated, what are certain things they can do to try to bring more regulation to it?
I think connection can be really helpful for people. So if there's people that you feel really connected to, feel really safe with, that's always helpful. And I think sort of coming back to sort of a somatic-based approach, a lot of times different sensations can be really helpful. So I always like the idea of placing like a ice pack or like a frozen bag of beans or something on your chest. That can sort of be helpful in the moment. Using sour candies or something to stimulate sort of your taste buds and whatnot, and the salivary glands, that can be helpful. Breathing and all of that.
Yeah, it sounds like it's so important to understand what's going on in your body and to just respond to whatever your body is feeling in that moment.
Absolutely. And I think while it's important sort of in the moment, I think what's also really important is sort of the long-term process of why is your body feeling unsafe? So we can say, okay, I'm going to use this coping tool every time. But if we don't really understand why am I feeling dysregulated, like what's actually happening internally, then we're just going to be sort of putting a Band-Aid over it every single time.
Another Band-Aid that I've seen you talk about before, not necessarily in terms of the nervous system dysregulation, but for when people are feeling their feelings, I've seen you talk about the idea of over-intellectualizing your feelings. So what does that mean?
Yes. So intellectualization in general is sort of the concept of, okay, I can logically see why this happened, where maybe I went wrong, or where this comes from, where in my history I can pinpoint this, and perhaps a logical next step solutions. So over-intellectualizing is using that as your primary coping tool. So intellectualization is important because it helps us process. But when we over-intellectualize, we're missing the key point of what is my experience of that internally. So we know all of these things happen, but how do I feel about that? And so it acts as sort of a form of disconnection. So it allows us to feel like, okay, I have control over this. I'm doing something about it. But I also have distance because I don't really have to feel it.
I think a lot of what I see on social media can contribute to over-intellectualizing your feelings. I think that today I always hear so much about attachment styles, love languages, people bringing psychology terms into their regular lives. So sometimes I think it's easy to be in a conversation with a girlfriend and be like, oh, okay, well, they obviously have an anxious attachment style and then you're avoidance, then this is what's happening. And then I think that even though we understand what's going on, that's preventing us from actually feeling the way that we feel too. Is that something that you see as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think in part, sometimes it comes from a really need to really understand things. But at the same time, I think we don't want to stop there. So if we're noticing, okay, I have an anxious attachment style, my partner has a avoidant attachment style, what does that feel like for you? What is that anxiety like for you in your body? How do you know that this is coming up? And so connecting it to the piece of like, how does that actually resonate with me internally and in my body is sort of the piece there that's missing.
And that's such a scary piece, but it's doable. I know it's weird and uncomfortable to try to describe sensations in your body if you've never done it, but it's worth it. And also I learned sometimes the things you describe don't need to really make sense, but they're still valid.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think people can be scared of it. And this is something I've heard a lot is that people often worry that, okay, if I do actually acknowledge this feeling or if I do feel this, then I'm just going to be consumed by it and then I'm not ever going to get out of it. And while that's a valid fear, I think emotions are so cyclical. You could be sad this morning and then be happy later. And the more that you sort of avoid those feelings and those sensations, then the more that they start to sort of build up. And similar to what you're saying, you can describe them in any way. And so it could be a sort of sensation word, quote unquote, or it could be in the form of a metaphor, in the form of a color, in the form of anything.
Because the emotions are going to go somewhere. Even if you don't want to describe the way you feel in your body, they're going to end up somewhere. So at least try to understand them.
Absolutely.
If someone feels like they over-intellectualize, and honestly, seeing some of your content about over-intellectualizing feelings, I'm like, oh my gosh, an old me feels called out because this is exactly what I would do when I would walk into therapy ready with all these descriptions. If somebody feels like they over-intellectualize, how can they start to go from their head and then more into their body?
I think it would depend on how comfortable that person is with their body in general. And so if there is sort of this large distance, then I would start similar to what we were saying earlier around just your basic needs. And so start to get comfortable with really acknowledging those things and choose an emotion that feels safer. And so when you do experience X, Y, and Z emotion, what is that like for you? How do you know? And that's something that I always sort of implore people to ask is, how do you know that you feel sad? How do you know that you feel angry? If you didn't know that sort of logically, what would send you the message that I don't feel good right now?
Oh my gosh, that's wild. I love that. Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of sometimes I'm feeling like overwhelmed and I'm like, let me just talk to a friend. And then if I talk to them, then I figure out how I feel. But really, you should be able to figure out your feelings on your own. But also, I guess it's okay to be overwhelmed sometimes too.
Absolutely. And I think there's times where, it's most helpful for us to sort of sort through it on our own, and other times where the help of someone that we find safe and loving is also really helpful.
In so much of what we talked about, there's so many new habits and skills that people need to build as part of their healing. Is it normal for people to feel grief when they are going through this healing?
Oh, absolutely. I think that in part, a lot of people are grieving the previous versions of themselves. They could be grieving the versions of themselves that they thought would exist right now. They could be grieving previous relationships, previous lives that they would have wanted to live, or the life that they could have had. So I think that there's a lot of grief to be processed in all of this.
If people are afraid of the grief, do you have advice for them on how they can still get over that hump and go into therapy?
Allow yourself to feel the fear. It's okay to be scared. I think allowing yourself to sit with the fact, it doesn't have to be like, okay, I need to acknowledge the grief. Just acknowledge the fact that you're scared of it. And if that's your starting point, that's your starting point.
Fear is a normal emotion. Like, I would put fear, happiness, sadness, love. I'm like, oh, they're all emotions, and you're supposed to feel the full spectrum of all of them. You can't really live without feeling the negative ones. So it's okay if you feel the bad ones. But I know it's hard. I'm also very optimistic. So I'm like, no, be angry sometimes.
And I think also a reminder that you also take the wheel in therapy. So if there's things that you're not ready to go through, then you're not ready to go through. And you're allowed to set that boundary with your therapist of like, oh, you know what? I'm actually not ready to go here. I think when people start therapy, they automatically assume like, okay, I have to rip open these wounds and then I'm just going to be fully exposed, and it can go at whatever pace that you need it to go.
I think that that's a great reminder too, that you are in the driver's seat. Because I know sometimes people feel like they don't want to say too much, or they don't want to feel like there are things where, oh, I might be exposing myself too much to my therapist. Do you think that there is such thing as sharing too much with the therapist?
Not at all. Not at all. I think that the more open that you can be, the better your experience. But I also recognize that there's a safety that's needed for that. And that safety comes over time.
You don't have to walk in on day one and be like, here are all of my traumas. You can build that trust.
Exactly.
So for people who have tried multiple therapists, and they haven't been able to find that good fit, what is your advice for them?
I think number one, like, I will acknowledge that going through multiple therapists and not finding a good fit, it can be exhausting and it can feel really discouraging. At the same time, I sort of liken it to dating, that not every person that you meet is going to be a good fit for you. And even in terms of friendships, not every person that you meet is going to be a good fit for you. And that doesn't mean that friendships don't work. That doesn't mean relationships don't work. And subsequently, that doesn't mean that you're not going to find a therapist that fits with you. And so I would say continue the search, but also take a look at the things that you really need and the things that you really want. And so if you're someone who has maybe been searching, but you're not really sure, think about the qualities that might be really important to you to have in a therapist and write some of those down, and making sure that ideally the therapist that you are consulting with, they have, free consultation sessions before you start to book with them, and ask those questions. Because just as much as you want this person, you also have to make sure that they are a good fit. And so making sure they're a good fit means asking some of the tough questions.
Yes, those free consultations are so important. Yeah, it's like a low risk date. And you're right. We spend so much time dating and trying to find a romantic partner. And I think it's okay to spend effort trying to find a therapy partner as well.
Absolutely. Because this is someone ideally that you're going to be sharing a lot of vulnerable stuff with. And so you want to make sure that it's a good fit.
And what about therapist breakups? I know that we had talked earlier about how you need to give it a few sessions to build that trust with a therapist. But what if someone feels like they have put in a considerable amount of time, whatever that is to them, and they are just not sure if it's the right fit? What would you say are signs that people should look for, whether or not it's a right fit, and how they should proceed if they aren't sure still with the therapist?
So number one, I would say if you're consistently not feeling heard or not feeling validated or seen in your sessions, if the sessions are maybe taking a direction that you don't necessarily want them to go, if you don't feel like you can really be yourself. So some of these things I would say could be a great opportunity to try conflict, right? And so talking to your therapist, if you feel safe and you feel comfortable about some of these things, like, hey, you know what? Sessions are turning in sort of a direction that I didn't really want them to, or I don't necessarily feel super heard in sessions because of X, Y, and Z. And whether or not you choose to actually move forward with that therapist, it can give you some experience in really understanding, how do I navigate conflict and how do I navigate some of these relationships? And you might find that with that therapist, maybe they're able to say like, hey, you know what? Thank you for the feedback. And the sessions move in a direction that you feel really good about. Or subsequently, maybe that's the end of the relationship.
Yeah, it's also a relationship. And I think that that's a good way to frame it. It's practice as well in terms of conflict and in terms of how to grow.
Absolutely.
So if there are people listening today and they want to foster more connection with their body, do you have tips on things that they can do with themselves in order for them to develop more body connection?
Yeah. So your everyday things that you might be doing. So when you're in the shower, what does it feel like for the water to fall on your face, on your back, on your hair? What does it feel like when you are eating something? What does the food feel like in your mouth? What does the spoon feel like? How does it feel sort of going down your digestive tract? Just taking note of everyday things that you would be doing, and taking a note of that can be helpful as far as like, oh, there is sensations happening constantly. So if you were to just take a moment right now to recognize, I can say that I can feel sort of the waistband on the middle of my stomach. I can feel my shirt draped over my shoulder. I can feel a little hair somewhere out of place that's sort of crawling on my neck. We often don't pay attention to these sensations because we're busy just doing other things, but there's stuff happening all of the time. And so paying attention to these little things that might feel a little bit more safe can help us later on down the road.
I've seen people describe that as being mindful or being present. And I think there's a reason why you hear about it, whether it's in spirituality or in therapy or in terms of people's physical health, because it is so important to stop and really think about how we're feeling. And also, just be so present in your body and be present in the moment.
Absolutely.
I would love to ask you about some of the other projects and initiatives you have going on. So with the Cognitive Corner, I know that you run workshops for different clients. Yes. Can you talk a bit more about the workshops and why people should consider being part of a workshop?
Yeah. So the primary workshop that I do is called Feeling Your Feelings, and it is a 3-week somatic-based workshop. The premise of it is taking a look at sort of like the psychoeducational piece. So what is actually happening? How do you sort of give a name to a lot of the things that are happening in your body? And then what do you do about it? How can we practice not only in the sessions, but outside of the sessions? How can you practice some of these things and move towards a life where you are feeling more embodied and more inside your body?
It sounds like a great way for people to start to learn these skills and to be in community. And it could be helpful whether or not they're already in therapy or if they're considering it and they just want to be in that environment and around those people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the big things that folks notice is the community aspect is sort of I would want to say one of the most impactful things, because I think because there's still somewhat of a stigma around mental health, we can all feel really siloed into a lot of the things that we experience. And so having people share really what's happening for them out loud and in sort of these group sessions allows people to say like, oh, wow, it's not just me. Like, you also experience that and you also experience that. Or maybe you've put words to something I've been experiencing that I haven't been able to put words to.
Yes, that's so true. That connection piece of it. I feel like all the time now with my friends and I, it's now in casual conversation where I'm like, oh my God, yeah, I just talked about that in therapy. Or my friend will be like, oh yeah, my therapist and I talked about this situation. It's nice that at least with the people that I've been able to hang around with, there's less of the stigma around it. And even if I also recognize therapy is expensive, I know that it's something that might be hard for people to access. So I completely understand that. But I think even being able to talk about how you feel with somebody, the connection that you get from that is just incredibly valuable to both feeling validated and to growing.
Absolutely. 100%.
I also saw on TikTok that you are writing a book. Can you tell us anything about that at this point? That is so exciting.
Yeah. So this has been in the works for a little while now, but the book will essentially be about what we've been talking about here today. So it's going to sort of give a sort of education, psychoeducation on what's happening in your body, why you might be disconnected, why you might be experiencing these things, challenge the reader to be more curious about their individual experience and the different parts of their identities and how we can move towards a more embodied self, essentially.
I can't wait to get a copy when it comes out. I know it's going to be so good, and I feel like I'm going to continue to learn so much from you. So thank you and congratulations on your upcoming book.
Thank you so much.
Simone, if people want to keep up with you or your practice online, where can they do that?
Yes. So keeping up with me, I am the Cognitive Corner on all social media, TikTok, Instagram. I took a little break from YouTube, but I'm there too. And then for the practice, you can go to our website, which is www.thecognitivecorner.ca.
Amazing. Simone, thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom today. And I can't wait to go off and feel my feelings.
Oh, thank you for having me. It was incredible.
Thank you so much, Simone, for sharing your wisdom. Make sure you follow her on TikTok. And if you know someone who is interested in feeling their feelings, make sure you share this episode with them. Now, I love to end each episode by answering a listener question. And this week, someone DM'd me asking me what I'm reading. So the book I just finished reading was Trick Mirror by Gia Tolentino. Gia is a Filipino-American journalist, and this book features a series of essays on culture, technology, and the internet. I love pop culture, so being able to read someone's nuanced and layered takes about different facets of modern culture is something that gets me very excited. There was even an essay about how Gia was on a reality show when she was a teenager, and then now as an adult, she could reflect back on how she was being produced as a teenager and how she was being turned into a TV character. And if you listen to the podcast, especially if you've listened to the very first episode of this podcast where I talked about what it was like watching myself on Survivor, you know I am so interested in the experience of having someone's real life experience turned into a character and a storyline that is easily digestible en masse. So I loved Trick Mirror. Also, Trick Mirror was actually gifted to me by Penguin Random House Canada. So thank you, Penguin Random House Canada, for the gift. In terms of what I'm reading right now, I wanted to read something more fiction. So I'm currently reading Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. I'm probably 2 to 3 chapters in at the time of recording. So far, super into it. So if I'm able to finish the book before I finish recording the episodes for this season, then I will tell you what I think about it. Thank you so much to the listener for submitting that question. If you haven't already, please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are on Instagram and on YouTube. It's at Happy to See Me Pod. Thank you so much for being here, and I will be happy to see you next Monday.